What's up guys, just want to make this video so I can share my impressions on the new EZONEs, my experiences and general thoughts of what it was like to play with these rackets. Not so much to give a firm opinion, but basically at this point everything is subject to change and I'm not going to commit to buying one unless I have full intrigue or interest. If you do like this video, please help me out by pressing the like button and subscribe to my channel for more videos. Follow me on Instagram for updates, and you can support the channel by buying me a coffee in the link below or giving me a super thanks. In this video, we'll be looking at the 2025 EZONE 98, EZONE 100 and the EZONE 98 Plus, also known as the V8. Check out the overlay for the specs and the specs that I demoed. All rackets were strung with Yonex Polytool Pro at 53 pounds with no modifications other than using a thinner replacement grip that was lighter, but I also re-added the weight back onto the handle to bring it back up to stock specs. Because all the demos were grip size 3 and I'm always grip 2. So I don't want the grip size to hamper my experiences since Yonex already run half a grip size thicker. So for the 2025 EZONE 98, for starters, I rarely read heavily into the technology or composition updates, though I do hear about them on the side from word of mouth, but I'm not sure what their intention is behind it because I don't read into the marketing materials. Obviously, I've heard about the worm seal canal, but I'm more interested in any changes to the mold, stiffness, and basic specs, just so that my experiences are not influenced by expectations that are described in the marketing materials. I mostly just play, feel it out and see what happens. The first comment that comes to mind when I was hitting with the EZONE 98 was that it kind of bored me. And not because of the paint job, because personally I hated it at first, but in person I thought it was much nicer in my opinion. But why does it bore me? That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing at all, but with all the slight changes that they've made, including a slightly different hoop shape, I would say there's nothing that the 2025 V8 version can do that the 2022 V7 version can't do in terms of performance if you're already very dialed in with it. They stack up relatively similar, but there are minor changes. It's just not enough to convince me to buy a new one if I already own the previous one and I already have a good experience with it. Now on the contrary, if you didn't like the previous one because it was hard on your arm, you thought it was very muted and maybe at times a little unforgiving, well, the new one certainly is more plush, it is more forgiving, and I think the feel is not bad at all. But if you didn't gel with the previous EZONE because you didn't like the way it moves through the air, you didn't like the way it suits your playstyle, then you're still out of luck because it's going to play very similar with some slight enhancements for the user friendliness, making it a more optimized racket but not a different racket. So is it worth the new 10% price hike that they included in the full retail price? Definitely not for me at least. But if money is not an issue for you and you haven't tried the V7 and you're looking to try an EZONE 98 in 2025 and you want the easiest and best performing one, the 2025 one is probably the right one to pick up and play. So as for my experiences, I said these were strung at 53 pounds, which are 5 pounds above my reference tension of 48 pounds, which is what I used in the 2022 version. In the 2022 EZONE 98, I felt at 50 pounds it was already on the tighter side, where I felt the sweet spot started to decrease a little bit and the feel became a little bit more brassier, harsh and leaning towards uncomfortable to use, especially with a stiffer poly. For the 2022 one, I always felt that even stringing at my reference tension at 48 pounds, I needed to take some time to break in the string and play it in until the tension lowered a little bit for it to really prime and play its best. In the 2025 version, 53 pounds was totally comfortable off the bat. The power levels didn't significantly feel like they dipped or feel any worse at tighter tensions. The string bed was very plush and had a very generous sweet spot overall. And I didn't feel any kind of shock or vibrations on off-center hits either. I did have some slight radiating shock through my index finger though, but that dissipated after the first session, so I'll count that as an outlier. Aside from that, I also thought that the 2022 version did not have the greatest feel, both in the sense of actual feel but also sound. Everything seemed a bit quiet for my liking, whereas the 2025 version seems to have done something a little bit more in the direction of the new gravity line, but to a lesser extent, making the throat more flexible, keeping a stiffer hoop with a very responsive string bed. In the 2025 version, the EZONE 98, I personally did not mind the feel at all. There's a much nicer and more noticeable pop to it in terms of feel and sound. and that contributed to an overall better hitting experience. There seems to be a bit more crispness off the ball contact, and combined with that, it's still a very forgiving frame. As for power, control, and all of that, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's any better or worse. We're talking very minor percentage differences, but at the very least, as I mentioned, I personally like the feel so that I'll have a better connection with the racket and thus more confidence, and that would probably improve the internal targeting and self-control. If anything, there might have been a slightly lower launch angle, but really we are dealing with a smooth poly, so once you put in a spin friendly string, that launch angle is probably going to increase a bit. The serve is the same, as good as always, the top serving racket in any line in my opinion. Not so much to say here. It's powerful, high speed, accurate, and absolutely unbeatable. The only thing that I might have felt negatively was there was less whippiness in the 2025 version, and the reason for that could be due to the slightly increased beam thickness at the top of the hoop, and having a shape that's even more isometric. It could be because more of the weight is concentrated higher up the frame, but my opinion is again subject to change, as I didn't play with my preferred grip size, and that can heavily influence that feeling just as much. And also my demo came in at 320 stock swing weight, which is probably on the higher end for the quality variants in EZONEs as well. After the first session, I was a little bit unimpressed and bored, but after a few more sessions, I'm just kind of like, yeah, the EZONE 98's a good racket, it's always going to be good, and there's not a lot that needs to change. So if anything, this is more headed in the right direction of optimizing the racket and making it an easier, more user-friendly, and better performing racket overall. Now with the EZONE 100, I've never invested a ton of time with it. I'm not typically one to use thick beam rackets because it's not my preference or made for my swing style either. But I have demoed it before and I have hit with my friends quite a few times. And the times that I tried it, I would say that I'm overall impressed. But if anything, with the EZONE 98 2022 version where I was slightly indifferent with the feel, I really did not like the EZONE 100's previous version, because the racket has such good stability so that you don't get much of feedback from anything, especially when a racket is reasonably muted to begin with. So in my impressions here, I'm confident in the same way that I described the EZONE 100 2025 version will play very similar to the 2022 version, but because I've never really talked about it, I'll just run through my experiences with it and provide an overview of what I found with an EZONE 100 from a fresh perspective. Feel is improved. Again, the same change I think is made with a new composition that gives a nicer and crisper response. Doesn't feel as quiet as the previous version, but overall playability is basically one-to-one otherwise. Since I don't have the previous version, if I were to buy one, personally I would go with the 2025 one, just because playing with a racket that you prefer the feel on would help you maximize your performance. Although I would play completely fine with the 2022 version, but obviously I would rather something that I prefer. Ground strokes are truly amazing with a low static weight, low swing weight, but massive power and ball speed coming straight off the string bed as soon as you strike it hard. The low swing weight may be exposed on occasion due to the lack of plow through, depending on the court and ball conditions, that it can lose a little bit of speed by the time the ball bounces, but the amount of force that is generated immediately at the contact point is really something else. If you do play in faster conditions, the ball is probably not going to come back very easily. It feels a lot more intuitive for me to pick up compared to other Power 100s, and that's because of its insanely controllable low launch angle for a racket of this nature, combined with some of the highest level of control that you'll probably experience from a true power racket. I can receive super fast balls, absorb the pace completely, or swing full blast back into the shot and still keep the ball in. Again, I didn't even test it in my grip size, and maneuverability and racket head speed would have been at least 10% improved immediately, so even my power generation and performance was probably partially limited in this playtest. It basically performs well in all facets. Power is obviously very high, stability is the core source of everything, it is rock steady like RF97s, Blade Pros and Pro Tours, but at such a low weight, and if you did add any extra weight, then it would pound for pound be one of the most stable rackets that you could find. That means that vibrations are kept to a minimum, so that comfort is very high, included with the additional plushness of the new 2025 layup, even though it does have a high stiffness rating. Pair it with any arm-friendly string and I'd be very surprised if you had any issues at all. It would probably have to be stemming from a pre-existing problem or technique faults. The stability then obviously means It is extremely forgiving across the whole string bed, and because it holds its course so well throughout the contact point, control is as high as it could be for a power racket, as I mentioned. So blocking, slicing, volleys, it all feels like butter. So it's both high octane offense but a great counter punching racket and defensive racket as well. Because the EZONE 100 has such high quality performances across the board, it's hard to really fault it anywhere aside from the thick beam, which hampers some of the ability to my type of serve style and also spin potential as well. You have to be pretty strong with great racket head speed to really do damage with spin on this racket, but it's not impossible. And pairing it with a very spin friendly string will probably go a long way as well. One-handers may feel a little clunky, but because there's a lot of plow and stability, if you really find your stroke, there's a lot of damage that can be done. I do not really struggle with any racket for one-handers anymore since I cleaned up my technique. If you can find the most efficient stroke, then it will probably be the best to suit such a thick beamed racket. The only thing is that the serves for me will take a bit of a readjustment from my end, and I think there's plenty of potential on serve, but I do have to change my technique quite drastically. And obviously I haven't spent the time or bought this racket to be able to readjust that at this point. I think I probably will need to be a little bit more athletic with my leg drive and let the racket do more of the work for me, whereas the EZONE 98 I can rely completely on my hand speed to generate big serves alone. All in all, the EZONE 100 is a high performance racket for a number of skill levels, and given that I have the EZONE 98 already, it is one of my two considerations worth a buy for this generation, with the other one being the EZONE 98 Plus. Now moving on to the EZONE 98 Plus. I'm sure, as with the other two EZONE models I've already talked about, that the rest of the performance characteristics are going to play extremely close to its predecessors, but I think the one that will benefit this one quite a lot will be the increased forgiveness levels, which will be at the forefront of what makes this model potentially something special. Imagine taking a good number of things that you like about the EZONE 98 and combining them with some of the aspects of the EZONE 100. Essentially, you could be getting an EZONE 98 on steroids. Now, whilst I'm not usually the biggest proponent of XL rackets because of their swing weight being artificially high, and with technique normally needing to be readjusted for the extra length, from past experiences I have found them incredibly cumbersome. For some reason, I just didn't feel it as much with this one, even at a swing weight of 340 in stock. Normally my forehand is the most affected by the maneuverability, but whether it's because I'm a much better player now or that I'm using a more efficient swing style, I did not feel the downsides of the XL as I normally would. For the one-hander in particular, it made everything that much better. I now have extra length to cover the backhand. Unlike the EZONE 98 standard version, the backhand would never flutter at contact with this one. And my experience essentially with the one-hander was like combining the speed and the whippiness of the standard 98 with the stability and plow of the EZONE 100. Now I obviously only tested it for a couple sessions, but imagine if I did fully commit to this for 2 or 3 months, adapting my muscles, my technique, my timing to the extended length. Even though I almost was able to pick this up and play immediately from the beginning, I'm starting to think what kind of damage that could be done if I actually committed to this. Obviously, people are going to think about the EZONE 98 Tour as a consideration, but with its higher swing weight being supplemented with a head heavier balance, and with a beam this thick, usually you would find an immediate trade-off with the stability for racket head speed. But here it didn't really feel like there was much of a trade-off at all. For this EZONE 98 Plus, you get the extra control from the high stability, you get the extra plow through, and with minimal drawbacks, which also made volleys just as nice as the 100, but felt even faster because you get to play with a super sleek throat from the 98 design. The biggest adaptation for me was a slightly lower swing speed on my forehand, but once my body adapts, I think I would be able to generate formidable power and speed as well. Coupled that with the serving experience of using an extended length racket, if you ever served with an XL, you already know how monstrous it can be. My biggest serves have never been matched since I served with the DR98 Plus, and basically this gives it all the same. With the standard 2022 98 model, I was getting an average of low 190 kilometers on my best serves, and no doubt I'd be able to tick over the 200s with an extended length. Now, two things is that I still wouldn't recommend it if you are a recreational player, ideally 4.5, and also if you have that modern next-gen type of swing style, unless you are freakishly athletic and strong, I think that extra handle length, you should be seeking a more efficient stroke style. But after trying the new EZONE 100, I was already in awe of the power and control levels, but I knew I lost out on the serve a lot. But with the EZONE 98 Plus, I'm really feeling the best of both worlds between the 98 and the 100. One thing I would like to try is finding a quality control outlier that has the static and swing weight just a bit lower and seeing if it still performs well enough, but now increasing my ability to generate racket head speed. That's what I'll be on the lookout for. Anyway, that concludes my first impressions of the 2025 EZONE line. I'm only considering to buy one of them in the future when they come out, or I may not at all. As I said, the changes can be quite minimal, especially if you already own the rackets. But for me, in this generation, it's looking like the 100 or the 98 Plus, and if I do, I'll make a full review on them otherwise. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.